households use savings and credit to manage shocks. Much of it has been focused, it's not specific to disasters, it's really any type of shock that a household experiences. It could be a health shock that stops one of the household members from earning an income in the household, or it could be somebody losing employment, something that's very sort of personal, or it could be some of the large-scale shocks, the disasters that we're thinking of in this workshop, in this evidence workshop. So the literature has sort of taken all of these shocks and just looked at, well, how do households use savings and credit? And to be honest, a lot of the early literature showed that these mechanisms are much more suitable for small shocks and for shocks that tend to affect maybe one household in a village or a market at once, and that they were put under strain when there was very large-scale shocks, such as climate shocks, that affected a lot of people all at once. And so actually a lot of the literature recently on these topics has been really looking at that. How do these instruments help households manage these idiosyncratic shocks rather than these climate shocks? So there is a question, to what extent can they be used effectively to manage disasters and climate shocks? So the existing evidence suggests that they're not, but perhaps there's some work to do to sort of testing this a little bit more. And I think particularly in the case of savings, I can't really think of a paper that has really tested this well, and I don't think there was, and that was sort of the sense from the brief as well. On credit, there is some really nice papers that Jen summarized in the brief, sort of two emerging cases, one on contingent credit, recovery loans in the Philippines, one on contingent credit, emergency loans in Bangladesh, both showing positive impacts on households in the short run at least, no long run studies yet. And one of these was a rigorous randomized control trial. On remittances, the second topic covered in this, the third, so the savings, credit, and then remittances, the third intervention covered under the household non-insurance DRF bucket. There is a really large literature actually that wasn't referenced in the brief, but it's just something that I was remembering. It was sort of some of what was written in the brief was reminding me of this very large literature documenting the impact of private transfers in helping households manage shocks, all kinds of shocks, and particularly these large-scale covariate shocks such as disasters and climate disasters. So some of the seminal papers are Stefan Durkon, Marcel Fachamp, Jean-Philippe Plateau, and a number of others that have Coton Revalion that have written on this. I think recently there's also been a literature that suggests actually not all of this is positive, that there are some sort of negative development impacts from having this be the main way that households manage shocks. It puts a lot of strain on networks. It can discourage productive investments when people know that they could be subject to this sort of random level of taxation. But there's some cases where networks could be used to beneficial effects. And I think one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading the brief was, well, what's the policy question here? What would a policymaker want to know about how they could support or what should be the policy approach to this way that households use to manage risk? And I mean, I thought there were then sort of two things that came to mind. One which was discussed in the brief, which is that, well, the cost of remittance transfers can actually be really high and quite prohibitive in some cases. And so there could be some policy work to do there on reducing the cost of transfers. And the second policy area as well, is there some way that we can think of strengthening these networks in a good way so that we can think about maybe providing insurance to people who are in networks of those who may need support. So there's a very interesting innovation that's being piloted in Burkina Faso at the moment, where weather index insurance is being sold to urban migrants to help ensure their transfers back to their rural household members when shocks occur. And so maybe that's, that's sort of a nice way of combining these literatures. The overall summary on the household level is that there's little evidence on savings for large covariate shocks, so it could be good to add to this, although there are some questions around whether this is really optimal for large, is this really an optimal way of dealing with large shocks? There's emerging evidence on contingent credit, and it'd be great to have more experimentation and evaluation there. I think we need much more evidence on private transfers, how they can be used and supported, and what the broader implications for development are. But so far, some research does suggest this is fruitful. And then one point which I think it was Tuga, I think that you mentioned, which is that, you know, this question of risk layering. So there's very few papers that look at that at the household level. So how would a household use savings, insurance, and contingent credit to sort of come up with this optimal mix of cost-effective approach to managing shocks? And we haven't really seen papers on that yet. I did work on one paper comparing savings and insurance, but that wasn't looking at this question of risk layering, and I think it's an important one. And then the other part of this session is looking at forecast-based finance. And here, I mean, it's a relatively new area. It's been a strong area of experimentation, some really successful pilots. And also now this year, a pretty large scale up of this approach in Bangladesh, with the UN using this approach across WFP, FAO, and UNFPA to provide support to a large number of households in advance of the floods this year in Bangladesh. What we see from the evidence is that a lot of the early sort of impacts, and I put them in quotes here, modeled estimates, and these are not estimates that are published in peer-reviewed journals. So so yes, there's often some good numbers bandied about, but maybe not from sort of rigorous impact assessments. However, there's been some recent positive and very plausible impact evaluations of pilots. One was published in a peer-reviewed journal, which was the Gross et al. Study of the Bangladesh pilot, and some other very good papers, FAO, and the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center forthcoming. But here, perhaps the issue is more to replicate and to have more experimental work, sort of continuing this emerging literature to develop a rigorous evidence base on how beneficial is this, what kind of support, what kind of triggers are most impactful. So that was sort of a quick summary of the brief plus perhaps my reading of the brief. But the goal of this session is really to hear a discussion from you and to hear from your experience, really two broad buckets of discussion questions. First, what do we need to do to get the assessment right? What was your initial feedback or thoughts as you read the brief, or have heard me sort of mention some of my takeaways on where the evidence base is on these topics? Do you think that this is about right? Do you think there's things that are missed there? So it'd be great to get your feedback on that. And secondly, also to, if you know of work that's ongoing that hasn't yet made it out into the public sphere that could sort of contribute to this emerging evidence base on these topics, what are you working on now, or what are you aware of that could contribute to the evidence landscape? And then thirdly, sort of, if we sort of move to going from trying to make sure that we capture everything that's written on these topics, to sort of narrowing down to say, okay, what are the really seminal pieces of work in this area, or what are the pieces where we're really, you know, the evidence is really robust, whereas, you know, really watertight, you know, the key pieces of research, do we have those for some of the topics? Do we already have those, or are we missing them? So sort of any sort of thoughts or comments on quality would be really helpful. So that's sort of in this first bucket of getting the assessment right. But we also want to be aspirational and think about the roadmap forward, and do a little bit of discussing and groundwork on our aspirations in this area. What is the evidence that we really need on this theme for progress. Who do we need to convince, or what do we need to learn, and about what? What kind of evidence do we need? What are the questions that we need answers for? And then secondly, what are the challenges to get there? Is it a question of data? Is it just challenging having the right methods? And thirdly, what are the opportunities for getting there? Are there some clear opportunities that can be taken advantage of to improve the evidence base? Some collective action or platforms to share knowledge, or some future collaborations in generating knowledge. So I'll stop there. This is sort of a brief run through of where we see the evidence right now, and it'd be great to have a discussion over the next hour on these two buckets. And so maybe what we could do is, first of all, go sort of focus on the first bucket, like getting the assessment right, and sort of think about these questions, and maybe go around the room with people contributing as they feel they want to, on providing feedback on this, on where the evidence base is, and addressing some of those questions in that left-hand column on the screen on getting the assessment right. And then we can go around again and think about sort of aspirationally where we want to get to as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So if we can just sort of keep those questions in mind, and then we can get back to seeing everybody's faces properly and have a good discussion. So oh, and I see we also have somebody else joining us. Is that correct? Sandra, do you want to introduce yourself? Or maybe not there right now. So yeah, so let's focus on these.
Hello, good morning.
Oh, hi Sandra.
Yes, good morning. From the Caribbean. Well, I'm seeing
Very
Jennifer
well.
for the first
Welcome.
time. Yes.
Great.
I'm here.
Great to thank you for joining us, and for joining us early as well. For you. And so I don't know if you just wanted to say a little bit about where you're from or what your interest is in these topics. It'd be great to just hear a bit.
Well, I'm from Grenada, and our organization, which is an NGO, the Interagency Group of Development Organization, is the partner to the Caribbean Policy Development Center in terms of implementing this on the ground here. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us. So yeah, so does anybody want to go first in terms of reflections on where the evidence base is? And I don't know if we can raise your hand either physically if your screen is on, or virtually if it's not, and then we can sort of organize ourselves that way.
Perhaps I can share a couple of first thoughts, and hopefully this will lead to more discussion. I think it's clear that from the amount of research that's been done out there that clearly more needs to be done. And when we think about the type of research that's being conducted too, it differs so much depending on if we're talking about academic research versus different types of research that's been collected by organizations that may work on this topic but may not be so scientifically rigorous. And then there's also a lot of research that could be being done about these experiences with non-insurance disaster risk financing by the private sector themselves, but that seems to always be quite lacking when we want to figure out exactly how the private sector has been succeeding or not succeeding when we think about introducing like these different types of contingency loans and whatnot and henceforth. And so I certainly think it would be interesting to discuss how we can bring together each of these different bodies that work on these topics in order to capture and get a more holistic view of what's actually happening on the ground. Because researchers are often focusing on a particular case and are able to closely monitor what's happening there, and implementers from organizations often don't have the same capacities and resources and time available to capture what's happening there. And then when we try to integrate it also with the experiences of the private sector, I think everyone's kind of aware of that. If it's not a positive story, it's going to be difficult to learn from them about what was working and what wasn't working and why. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to learn more about different perspectives on this, how we can bring these different experiences together.
I mean, I think that's a really valuable, I know that, yeah, I think this, and it's a good reminder, Jennifer, thank you for mentioning this, is that like good learning is holistic, right? It's learning about the process of implementing, as well as learning about the end impacts, right? And we're not going to get the proper story just by focusing on one of them may end up in the journal article, but the other stuff is going to be extremely important for thinking about how this actually happens and gets scaled up. So I know that's very much the approach that we've been taking over the last year with the forecast-based finance work we've been doing, and it's been really, really important. There's a lot of learning to do even before you get to having an impact. So any other thoughts on this topic of making sure that we're being holistic in our learning on this, or in any other aspects? Tuga, your hand is up. Is it?
It is. It is.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm still working out the platform.
So just a small point. I mean, you mentioned this sort of risk layering at a household level, which would be fantastic to research. But I wonder if we could, as a sort of a lower hanging fruit, look from the supply side at the success rate of integrating different forms of disaster risk financing, either bundling them or presenting them in that way. I think there's been a lot of sort of, you're either selling microinsurance in this way for this product, even not even bundling too many different perils, but then quite separate from other disaster risk financing interventions. And one of the things that I'm very encouraged by the shift towards forecast-based financing. I think if we could get some preparedness in place, that would be, and some anticipatory action, that's fantastic. But it sometimes could be posed as an either-or. And it's how do we actually have a cohesive narrative, and what is that cohesive narrative of multiple tools needed, and how do they interlink and work together to encourage each other? And it could be something like, if you just have this insurance coverage, this is what your losses will look like. If you have this and you have in place these other disaster risk financing mechanisms, this is what this could, something a bit more looking holistically, I think would help us all towards that goals.
Well, that's great. So this sort of resonating with this really being an evidence gap, and sort of some nice suggestions there on how we might get a bit further forward in our thinking and how to fill that gap. Great, thanks. Anybody else want to come in on sort of reflections on what they see the evidence gap being in this area? Simon Wagner.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to say that I think I can confirm what Jen has observed in her brief. From my proposal, I was also looking at literature that looks at shocks and how communities or networks are dealing with it, and I also had the impression that it's mostly about small-scale shocks that only affect a few households, but I haven't found a lot on large-scale shocks, so that's something I can confirm from my point of view. I also wanted to mention I was doing a systematic review on flood risk related literature in Western Africa. So I looked at all the ECOWAS states and papers that have been published in that area. And I was interested, since the topic of my PhD is the potential role of insurance or risk transfer mechanisms in flood risk management. I wanted to look at the case studies and to see what has been done before the flood, after the flood event, and what was recommended by the research. And what I found is that mostly after the flood event, what people did was to mutually support each other. So be it in family networks or community networks. But the most frequent response I observed was mutual support between people. So I think that underscores the importance of non-insurance risk transfer mechanisms. Yeah, so I hope to publish that paper soon and maybe make it available to you. It could be another piece of evidence that is interesting to those questions. I can say that from Togo, there's something called Mothers Club or Club de Mère. So it's a women's savings group on a village level, and they have two different funds. So in one is like a solidarity fund for health shocks. So if people need to go to the doctor, need to pay health bills, they can get a payout from this fund. But it also is, I think, a small scale shock because it's only a few people being affected at the same time. So it only covers health impacts. And also there's another savings scheme that looks at income generating activities. And they also buy stuff in bulk and they store it so that it's cheaper for them. So I can also send you a link to there's even a nice document from the Red Cross on that. And on top of that, there's forecast-based financing in Togo, but I haven't yet found out the current state of it. It has been launched in 2017, but I don't know if it's active right now, but it's something I would also like to include in my research. Yeah, so I think for my research, I can say that I would like to look at the impact of those risk transfer mechanisms that are out there, be they informal or formal, and kind of measure them with my household survey. And that's some avenue we could explore together and discuss in the future, I think. Yeah, I will send you those links if you want. Maybe they'd be helpful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. That'd be great to get those links. So any other comments on the evidence sort of assessment? And maybe we could, I mean, maybe what we can, yeah, so any other comments? And then I think what I'm hearing from the comments so far is that it's broadly correct, that nobody's sort of aware of large bodies of literature that haven't been, or experience that haven't been documented. So would that be sort of a right, maybe a right assumption to take? And then in which case it would be, I mean, I guess the one other question to ask is if you're aware of anything that might be forthcoming in this area, or whether you've got any reflections on what is seminal in this area before we move on to thinking about the way forward. So sort of a last opportunity for comments on where we are today.
Good morning. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sandra. I'll go a second.
Well, I'm not an academic, so excuse me. But in Grenada, when we experienced Ivan in 2004, I was very fascinated, and I still am, by the Adventist churches. They were part of the global scheme. And unlike a number of other churches, especially the more traditional ones, which up to this day, some of their buildings have, you know, still have not been repaired. They, in fact, build back all in a very reasonable time and build back better. I am wondering if any of you are aware of the scheme that's run by the World Adventists, and whether or not there are any lessons that could be learned and that may be applied to what we are trying to do in terms of microinsurance in our region. Because I think it was at our last round table, a number of the concerns as it relates to affordability of insurance, whether in fact there is, and I think a colleague this morning made some reference to it, you know, what kind of product, what kind of service could be offered? Because if we're thinking about the vulnerable, we also want to lift them. We want to empower them. And therefore the issue of saving, you know, important. So I have just thrown that on the table. You know, I don't know if we can make any sense of it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sandra. That's something that wasn't covered in the evidence brief, but actually does play a huge role in some countries, is the role of churches in building back better. And especially because of the way that a lot of people do also kind of invest in the church with the understanding that they'll support them if some type of shock occurs. I mean, this is certainly, I think, something that we should look more into and covering. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also just really interesting, Sandra. Thanks for raising it, for sort of pointing out that, look, some organizations have got this figured out, right? When how to manage the risk of their members, as it were, and to get their buildings rebuilt. And so it'd be good to think about what kind of financing mechanisms they're using and what rules they're using in terms of how these how the funds get dispersed. So that's great. Thanks for raising it. And it sounds like it would be really interesting to look into more and understand what they're doing. And the point on sort of this, I very much like the point also on savings and the role that they play in empowering poor and vulnerable individuals, and how we might want to think about that aspect of things when we're, say, comparing savings versus credit or savings versus other schemes. So thanks for raising that. Simon, did you want to, I think you were going to speak also, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to say that we're currently, we've designed a monitoring evaluation framework for the Global Risk Financing Facility, the GRIF of the World Bank, which is a huge pot of money by Germany and the UK. And what one thing we're really trying to do is to learn lessons from individual country projects, which I think is very hard. We have a very, very big MEL framework that we've developed with a whole bunch of consultants. But the thing that I'm really asking myself is, like, in terms of non-insurance mechanisms now, because that's, I guess, the name of our working group, what would be what do we, I'm not a researcher, but what would be maybe the most pertinent types of knowledge gaps we have from your research perspective, maybe get some advice from you. So I'm basically here to learn and listen a little bit of what would be the best, like the most pertinent, most eminent questions that you think we could work on? Would it be like, you know, a bit of a comparison between instruments, or maybe do a really in-depth qualitative study in one country in a certain region? I know it's a really, really general question, but it's really what I've been asking myself, because otherwise we might just end up having 10 very light touch evaluations of countries, collecting extremely general lessons learned, where we basically then, I don't know, don't make a case for or against, or basically for this. My fear is that if we don't do that, the main donors, which I just mentioned, will just maybe lose some interest, and I think that's a huge danger right now we're facing, with obviously big policy changes, or political changes in the UK, upcoming elections in Germany, in Japan. So so it would be really great to hear from you, Ruth, or from other researchers that are obviously all on the call, which is great. To hear a little bit for an evidence roadmap, what would be the most crucial elements of study going forward?
That's great, Simon. And that really, I think, brings us really nicely to sort of the next bit, which is sort of setting our aspirations. And I think what we can do with an evidence gap analysis is to see where there is evidence and where there isn't. And I think that already does point to some areas, such as sort of layering, such as the question of, well, can savings have an impact? Can we understand that better, how to encourage it, when it can, when it can't? What are the long run effects of contingent credit? You know, having these replication studies for forecast-based finance, so we can see where the gaps are. But I think in order to really prioritize here, and to avoid the issue that you just exactly described of investing a lot, but actually at the end of the day not having the evidence we needed to convince the people we needed, I think we need to step back from the evidence gap and sort of ask ourselves the question of, well, what is it that we need to, who do we need to convince, or who do we need to, or what is it that we need to learn for there to be progress in this area? Is this an area where we know already what to do, and we just need to show that it really works well, and yeah, sure, refine our learning of it, but we've already got some good idea, and it's really about having solid, rigorous evidence to document impact, convince the funders that we may need to convince? Or is this an area where we don't know yet whether it's a good idea, or exactly what sort of shape it would take, or what context it's going to work well, and we sort of need more of that experimentation, as it were? Or is this something where where the challenge really is understanding these implementation lessons from going from pilot to scale up? So I think it would be really useful to maybe just all of us share our reflections on that, like on what do we think, and I think this is something that we can all contribute to, researcher or non-researcher. What is it that we see where we find ourselves stuck in terms of moving forward? Okay, Tuga, thank you. Thanks for joining. So my sense on the forecast-based finance work is that what we don't, so I think there's a very strong narrative around it. There's already a good understanding of how to do it. Yes, we can get better at getting better triggers, matching the triggers better to the intervention. But where we really, what we don't have yet is the evidence that is broad enough and rigorous enough to convince donors to change how they finance disasters, to say, yes, I'm so convinced this is a better way. You've shown me so many studies that show this is that is really impactful. It makes a big difference. It reduces the overall cost of responding to disasters so much that I'm going to give up my ability to choose to fund disasters that emerge, and instead I'm going to put that money into a pot that will go to disasters that may or may not happen. So my read on it is that's the evidence gap for the forecast-based finance, that we should probably prioritize this. That sort of having the really solid evidence to bring about the actors that are not currently convinced that they need to give up power and to sort of persuade them to do that. I think those of us working on it, we're already convinced by it, so we don't need to convince ourselves. It's more these other people who need to convince. On some of the household level mechanisms, I think they're the questions I have, and I'm not sure yet whether, I'd love to hear from all of you whether you think these are the right ones, but I do have this question around savings. I really like the idea of savings. I think they're flexible. I think just like Sandra said, they empower households, but I don't know how far we can take them in terms of, you know, how much can they help households? If there's a really bad shock, is it realistic to think of a household having enough savings to really manage that? What could they manage with savings? And so what is the potential? So I think for me, that's a question on savings. On the contingent credit, it seems that we're getting there in terms of the experimentation. And so for me, it would be more sort of the long run impacts, and also for me there, the issue is equity. Who gets left out of a credit-based approach to disaster response? Is that all well and good for credit-worthy households, but yet we've still left out some of the poorest of the poor who can't access those mechanisms? So for me, that would be the question there. So it's really more like a feasibility study, like can this work and for what? And so some sort of small scale pilots could do the job there, and maybe some of the sort of, maybe it can be quite qualitative to start with, just testing these things out. And then this question of layering as well. So, okay, maybe, you know, in a few years' time, we'll know what savings can do, what credit can do, but how do we mix and match these in an optimal way? And how do we give households the tools they need to be able to work out how to do that? My big question on the networks is, we know that networks are, there's a lot of evidence documenting that this is the way households primarily manage disasters today, in the absence of functioning markets and in the absence of a state that's there for them when they need it to be there. But to what extent is this something that we need to take into account to what extent is this something that we need to say, okay, that's a good thing and we need to encourage it more? And as we design our policy solutions, as we design adaptive social protection, as we design our next microinsurance product, we need to think about the fact that actually this is how households are going to be responding to disasters, and we just need to sort of work out how it fits with that. Or is this something that is that actually is a situation that we need to move away from, and that households do it because that's all they can do? Like, is this an optimal choice, or is this a sort of a feature of the fact that there's a lack of options for these households? So for me, that's where I see a big gap on the network side, is really the question to which, to what extent how do we fit what we're doing with networks? But that's my take. I'd love to hear what other people in the room are thinking.
Yeah, thanks so much for that overview, Ruth. I have to say, I agree with many of your points, and I think there's just a lot more understanding and research that needs to be done, especially considering that the circumstances in different countries change so much, and what's available to everyone is also greatly differing. And when we talk about savings too, it's this question of also looking at the different types of savings that are available, whether it's somebody privately saving themselves, whether it's putting it into account and creating some sort of barrier or motivating factor from using the savings by, for example, like if they're not using the savings during a flooding occasion, they're going to have to pay a small fee. Or these types of saving schemes where we look at group funds together, where you have then this social mechanism pressure. And I think examining like how each of these different types of savings can affect the effectiveness of it in the long run, and also just how we examine what is effective too, because typically you find that the more flexible it is, okay, more people might start saving then and become part of these saving schemes. However, it may not be the most effective when it comes to managing to save a lot of money for a big event, right? And so looking at how, yeah, we both measure things in terms of success in getting a lot of people to start practicing something, but also success in it actually reaching its goal of helping people to cope with these mechanisms, right? And yeah, I do think we need to explore more there and see then, as Tuga and Ruth and everyone was expressing before, how these different types of risk can be layered together too. Because I think often, especially with the international development community, there's a certain type of instrument that's then being perpetuated, like insurance, as something to be worked on. And to be further developed. And then this is kind of sold as a solution then to policyholders in the country, but we all know that this in and of itself is not a solution, right? And so we need to show exactly how these different instruments can work together in order to provide a more long-term strategy, right? Because while insurance is suitable, you know, for these extreme cases that only happen every couple of years, it's not going to be the solution for everything else for these more common events. And so, yeah, we need to think more about then how we can combine both what's being done in the insurance, but along with what people are privately doing on the savings side, and then also, yeah, with the contingent credit and family mechanisms and church schemes. All of these different instruments are interacting together, right? And people have to make a decision on which one they want to use. And when we only focus on what the effectiveness of one is, we're leaving out like how these other instruments are either positively or negatively affecting the effectiveness of like insurance or other types of instruments.
Thanks, Jennifer. So any other reflections on the questions for going forward, or any challenges in answering some of these questions? Jennifer mentioned some of, you know, the infrequency of some of the events that we're looking at, or any opportunities in meeting these challenges. And I think we'll go for probably another 15 minutes or so in the discussion. So please feel free to raise any comments you have, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, well, maybe we'll wrap up now. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. It was great to hear your reflections. If you have thoughts on some of the questions that we've raised today, please do email me, email Jennifer, contact the organizers somehow with your reflections. Simon Wagner, thank you for sending the studies that you did on the chat. Likewise, anybody else that has studies they think we should be looking at, or interesting case studies. Sandra, thank you for raising our attention to the Adventist churches. Please, yeah, so please, any other thoughts that come to mind, however tangential they may seem, please do send them. And thank you very much for your participation today.
Yeah, really quick before we finish up, thank you, Ruth. I think it was a great session, and thank you so much for that presentation. And so the idea is during tomorrow's session, which will be taking place at the same time, 3 o'clock European Central Time, we're going to have a read back where we'll hear what the outcomes from each of the group discussions were. And would anyone be willing to do the readout for our group? So Zula will be able to email you the notes that she took. And so we just thought it would be nice, instead of having the same people present on the topic, if someone would volunteer from this group to read out what we discussed in tomorrow's session.
Sorry, Jennifer, when is the session? At 3 tomorrow?
Yeah, 3 o'clock Central European time. So
Yeah, I think I can do that if nobody else wants to do it. Sure.
yeah, that would be great, Simon. Thank you so much for volunteering.
Okay.
Great. Yes. Thank you very much, Simon. And thanks everybody for a great discussion. And see you, some of or all of you, tomorrow.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.